Introduction to the Romance of the Commonplace. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. The Romance of the Commonplace by Gelett Burgess. Introduction. To let this book go from my hands without some one more personal note than the didactic paragraphs of these essays contained has been, I must confess, a temptation too strong for me to resist. The observing reader will note that I have so rewritten my theses that none of them begins with an I in big type. And though this preliminary chapter conforms to the rule also, it is for typographical rather than for any more modest reasons. Frankly, this page is by way of a flourish to my signature, and is the very impertinence of vanity. But this little course of philosophy lays my character and temperament, not to speak of my intellect, so bare that, finished and summed up for the printer, I am all of a shiver with shame. My nonsense gave, I conceit myself, no clue by which my real self might be discovered. My fiction I have been held somewhat responsible for, but escape for the storyteller is always easy. Even in poetry, a man may so cloak himself in metaphor that he may hope to be well enough disguised. But the essay is the most compromising form of literature possible, and even such filmy confidences and trivial gaieties as these write me down for what I am. Were they even critical in character, I would have that best of excuses, a difference of taste. But here I have had the audacity to attempt a discussion of life itself, upon which every reader will believe himself to be a competent critic. By a queer sequence of circumstances, the essays, begun in the Lark, were continued in the Queen, and if you have read these two papers you will know that one magazine is as remote in character from the other as San Francisco is from London. But each has happened to fare far afield in search of readers, and between them I may have converted some few to my optimistic view of everyday incident. To educate the British matron and young person was, perhaps, no more difficult an undertaking than to open the eyes of the California native son. The fogs that fall over the Thames are not very different to the mists that drive in through the Golden Gate, after all. Still, I would not have you think that these lessons were written with my tongue in my cheek. I have made believe so long that now I am quite sincere in my conviction that we can see pretty much whatever we look for, which should prove the desirability of searching for amusement and profit rather than for boredom and disillusion. We are in the day of homespun philosophy and handmade dogma. A kind of mental atavism has made science preposterous. Modern astrologers and palmists put old wine into new bottles, and the discussion of psychomachy bids fair to revolutionize the eternal feminine. And so I, too, strike my attitude and apostrophize the universe. As being in part a wholesome reaction from the prevailing cult, I might call my doctrine pagan science, for the type of my proselyte is the Bornese war chief, peripatetic on Broadway, an amused wanderer. But I shall not begin all my nouns with capitals, for it is my aim to write of romance with a small r. Also, my philosophy must not be thought a mere laissez-faire. It is an active, not a passive creed. We are here not to be entertained, but to entertain ourselves. I might have called this book A Guide Through Middle Age, for it is then that one needs enthusiasm the most. We stagger gaily through youth, and by the time old age has come we have usually found a practicable working philosophy. But at 40 one is likely to have a bitter hour at times, especially if one is still single. Or, so they tell me. I shall never confess to that status, and shall leap boldly into a white beard. A kindly euphemism calls this horrid half-way stage one's prime. I have here endeavored to justify the usage, though I am opposed by 1,000 poets. If some of these essays seem but vaguely correlated to my major theme, you must think of them as being mere illustrations or practical solutions of the commonplace, solved by means of the theory I have developed and iterated. It was hard indeed to know when to stop. But ragged as are my hints, I hope that in all essentials I have covered the ground and formulated the main rules of the game of living. One does not even have to be an expert to be able to do that. End introduction. Essays 1 and 2 of The Romance of the Commonplace by Gelett Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 1, April Essays. They were begun in the April of my life, and though it is now well into mid-June, some of the glamour of the spring yet inspires me, and I am still a-wondering. I have tried every charm to preserve my youth, and a drop of wine and a girl or two into the bargain, but the game is near played out. But what boots marbles and tops when one is initiated into the mysteries of billiards and chess? It has taken me all these years to find that there is sport for every season, and the rules vary. To make a bold play at life, then, without cheating, which is due only to a false conception of the reward, and with the progress, rather than the particular stage reached, in mind, is my aim. So I have tossed overboard all my fears and regrets, and gone in for the higher problem of maturity. Still, a few of the maxims I drew from my joys and sorrows in the few calmer moments of reverie persist, and these all strengthen me in the romantic view of life. A man must take his work or his art seriously, and pursue it with a single intent. He must fix upon the realities first of all, but there is room for imagination as well, and with this I have savoured my duties as one puts sauce to pudding. Enough has been written about the eagerness of motive, of sobriety, and all the catalogue of virtues usually dignified with capital initials. I own allegiance to an empire beside all that, another Forest of Arden, the tinkle of whose laughter is a permanent sustained accompaniment to the more significant notes of man's sober industries. Must I be dubbed trifler, then, because I make a game of life? Every man of spirit and imagination must, I think, be a true sportsman. It is in the blood of genius to love play for its own sake, and whether one uses one's skill on thrones, or women, swords, or pens, gold or fame, the game's the same. Surely it is not only the reward that makes it worth while, it is the problem, the study of each step on the way, the disentangling of the knotted cord of fate, the sequence and climax of move after move, the logical grasp of what is to come upon the chessboard. As it is in the great, then may it not be in the small? To one of fancy and poetic vision, mere size is an accident, a personal element, a relative, not an absolute, quality of things. The microscope reveals wonders to the scientist as great and as important as does the telescope. To the poet, a primrose by the river's brim has the beauty of the infinite. And so nothing is commonplace, or to be taken for granted. One needs only the fresh eye, the eagerness of interest, and this universe of workaday things, which, with the animals we get for a penny plain, may be coloured with a tuppence worth of mind by which we are richer than they. We have all passed through that phase of art appreciation in which familiar objects are endowed with an extrinsic aesthetic value. The realist discovers a new sensation in a heap of refuse, the impressionist in the purple shadows of the hills. In weaker intellects, the craving for this dignifying of the obvious leads to the gilding of the rolling pin, or the decalcomania decoration of the bean-pot. With something of each of these methods I would practice upon everyday affairs, and make them picturesque. This is perhaps a characteristically Oriental point of view of life. Undoubtedly it is the Japanese pose, and it is well illustrated in their art. What by Korin would be thought too insignificant for portrayal? He had but to separate an object or a group of objects from its environment, and he beheld a design, with line, mass, colour, and notan. Art was to him not a question of subject, but of composition. He held his frame before a tiny fragment of the visible world, any fragment, indeed, and placing that in its true position, not in regard to its surroundings, but in regard to the frame, it became a pattern. May we not, for our diversion, do thus with life? If we hold up our frame, disregarding the accidental shadows of tradition and establishment, we may see bits of a new world. It is thus that the man from Mars would view our life and manners. Unsophisticated, he would hold his frame in front of a man, and cutting him off from his family, his neighbors, his position in society, he would see a personage as real and as individual as the man with the glove, or the unknown woman, is to us. He would bring an uncorrupted eye and see strange pictures in the facts of our jaded routine. He would see, in accustomed meetings and actions, hidden possibilities and secret charms. He would witness this drab life of ours as a bewilderingly endless romance. Nothing would be presupposed, nothing foreseen, and each turn of the kaleidoscope would exhibit another of the infinitely various permutations of human relationship. Such is the philosophy of youth. It denies the conventional postulates of the Philistine. It would not accept the axioms of the unimaginative. 2 and 2 may prove to make 5, upon due investigation. Seemingly parallel cases may widely diverge, and the greater may not always include the less, in this non-Euclidean geometry of life. It transmutes the prose of living into the poetry of idealization, as love transmutes the physical fact of osculation into the beatitude of a kiss. It makes mysteries of well-known occurrences, and it turns accepted marvels into simple truths, comprehensible and self-evident. Civilization refines and analyzes. It seeks the invisible rays of the spectrum and delights in overtones, subtle vibrations, and delicate nuances of thought. So this neglected philosophy of enthusiasm also gleans the neglected and forgotten mysteries of humanity. Its virtue is in its economy. It wrings the last drop of sensation from experience. Like modern processes of manufacture, it produces good from what was considered but waste and tailings. By a positive contribution to happiness, it refutes the charge of trifling, for in the practice of this art one does not pick up what has been thrown away. All's fish that comes to its net. But it is more than a science. It has more than an economic value for happiness. It is a religion. The creed of hope bids one wonder and hope and rejoice. It teaches us to listen for the whispered voice, to see the spirit instead of the body of the facts of life. But it does more. It is illuminating, and reveals a new conception of beauty. There is an apocryphal legend of the Christ that tells how he with his disciples were passing along a road when they came upon the body of a dead dog. Those with him shrank from the pitiful sight with loathing, and drew away. But Jesus went calmly up to the decaying flesh, and leaning over it, said gently, "How beautifully white are his teeth!" The customary moral drawn from the story is one of gentleness and pity, the kindness and charity of looking at the good rather than the evil that is present. But it has a more literal meaning, and teaches clearly the lesson of beauty. For it has come to this, that even in our pleasures we are influenced by prejudice and tradition. Some things are as empirically branded beautiful or ugly as others are declared right or wrong, and to this dogma we conform. Corin, when he held his frame before a clothesline fluttering with damp garments, saw not only an interesting design, but a beautiful one. Yet the Monday's wash may be taken as something typically vulgar and ugly to the common mind. We Anglo-Saxons have debased many facts of life, once rightly thought of as exquisitely beautiful, into the category of the beast. Sexual passion is the great example, but there are myriads of lesser things which, viewed calmly, purely, as some strange god, able to see clearly without passion or prejudice, might view them, would take on lovely aspects. When such situations approach the pathetic, as the sight of some forlorn, half-naked mother nursing her child on a doorstep, or the housemaid, denied of the chance of seclusion, embracing her lover in the publicity of the park, this diviner phase of common human nature is patent to the casual observer. When they approach the comic also, it is easier to believe that every scene may have its complementary phase, and the most careless may read the joke between the lines. But much of the more subtle delight of life escapes us, like the tree toad in the oak, because it is so much a part of its surroundings. Its charm is of so intrinsic a value that we do not notice it. We are used to finding our beauty within gilt rectangles, set off from other things, not so denominated, as especially worthy of regard. We expect it to be labeled and highly colored. Two things alone remain safe from this bias of custom: love and youth. To the lover, the tying of a shoelace on his mistress's foot may be as sacred a rite, and may contain as much sentiment as the most impassioned caress. To the child, the mud pile has possibilities of infinite bliss. To the one comes eternal beauty, to the other eternal mystery. And so, to touch these forever, and to lose no intermediary sensation of charm, whether it be humour, romance, pathos, or inspiration, to be bound by every link that connects youth to love, that was my April essay. End of Essay 1. Essay 2, Getting Acquainted. Two lives moving in mysterious orbits are drawn together, and for an instant, or maybe forever after, whirl side by side. We call the encounter an introduction, and we usually proceed to stifle the wonder of it by impersonal talk of art, books, or the drama. It is an everyday affair, and does not commonly stir the imagination. And yet to the connoisseur in living, the meeting may be an event as well as an episode. He is a discoverer come to an unknown shore. It may be the margent of a boundless sea, or not, but of a certain it is swung by new tides and currents to be adventured and plumbed. How can we, supercivilized out of almost all real emotion, develop the potential charm of this first glimpse of a new personality? It is guarded by conventionality. The shutters are down, the door is barricaded. You may knock in vain with polite interrogations, and no one appears at the window. Must we perforce set the house afire, smite or shriek aloud to bring this stranger's soul to his eyes for one searching gaze, face to face? The time is so short. We must greet and pass on to the next. We exchange easy commonplaces, and so the chance vanishes. Why not defy custom and boldly snatch in that magic moment some satisfactory taste of warm human intercourse? Curiously enough, this strangeness, this lack of background in new acquaintances, is one of the freshest charms of meeting. Who would not throw off all restraint and talk frankly with a man from the planet Mars or Venus? Could we resurrect an inhabitant of Atlantis, we could give him our whole confidence, and even a South Sea Islander, were he intelligent, might be our confessor. Where then shall we draw the line of convention? Mars is some 140 million miles away. San Francisco is but 9,000. The ratio is inadequate, but there is a guarantee of candor in mere distance. May we not apply the same rule to nearer neighbors, and look upon them in this interesting light? There is no such stimulating instant possible for old friends, for they are bound by preconceived ideals of personality. They are pigeon-holed as this or that, circumscribed by mutual duty and sacrifice. They must reconcile present whims to past vagaries. They are held to strict account of consistency with previous moods. But on our first meeting with another we are free of all this constraint, and if we have courage we may meet soul to soul without reserves. We may confess unreliable things in that moment, for there is no perspective of formulated opinion into which the confidence must be fitted. The little secret is safe alone in the new mind, and will not be held to intolerable account. We may even, for this once, state a brutal truth, for we are unpledged to distressing considerations. We may be, in some few sacred thoughts, more intimate with a stranger than with an old friend. Such is the divine franchise of this first sudden opportunity. No compact is yet sealed. You must take me as you find me, like me or not. It matters little, since it is for us to say whether or not we shall meet again. This play is, as Dickens says of melancholy, one of the cheapest and most accessible of luxuries, for the scene is always ready, set in the nearest drawing-room. Every stranger has a possible fascination and comes like a prince incognito. It is probably your own fault, not his, if the disguise is not dropped during the first impetuous flurry of talk. Children do these things better, making friends not inch by inch, but by bold advances of genuine confidence, yet approaching each new mystery with respect. So we too, like the child, must dress these our dolls and put them into their first mental attitudes with sincerity and trust before they will come to life. We must put much feeling into the relation, giving and taking, so much that we cannot only confide our tenderest spiritual aspirations, but invest trifles with unaccustomed worth and significance. These are not impossible sensations, even for such accidental fellowship, for nothing is too unimportant to reveal personality and orient one's point of view. But we must proceed from the inside outward, beginning with truths and thence to fancy. It is the a priori method, not deducing the character of your neighbor from his visible idiosyncrasies of taste and habit, but boldly inducing a new conception, making him what you will, and varying the picture by successive approximations as his words and actions modify your theory. No one is too dull for the experiment, as no mummy is too common to be unwrapped. Granted only that he is newly found, so that you have imagination, romance, and sentiment on your palette, you may paint him as you will. The colors may wash, but for the while he is your puppet and must dance to your piping, if indeed you do not become his. There are those, of course, who will but cry "oh" and "ah" to your essays, dolts with neither wits nor words nor worth, who take all and give nothing. No one can set such damp stuff afire. Well, after all, though you have unmasked, retreat is still possible. With how many duller friends have you given your parole and cannot escape with honor? Indeed, it is not so desirable that we should always win, as that the game itself be worth the playing. One must not expect to make a friend at each introduction. To make the most of the minute in this way, then, to strike while the iron is hot, and better to heat it yourself, this is the art of getting acquainted. It is the higher flirtation, not dependent upon sex or temperament, but of many subtler dimensions, and though it soon turns into the old familiar ruts, the first steps, made picturesque by a common fancy, shall never lose their glamour, and one shall remember to the very last how the first shots went home. But do not confound playing with playing a part. One may do all this sincerely, honestly giving good coin, and that is the only game worth while. For of a sudden it may wake into new beauty like a dream come true, and you will find yourself in Arcady. No more fooling then, for the real you is walking by my side, hand in hand. We shall not be sorry either, shall we, that we hurried round the first corner into the open, that we jumped a few hedges? Surely we have an infinite friendship for our inaccessible goal, and though the first rush was exhilarating, there are more inspiring heights beyond. End of Essay 2. Essays 3 and 4 of The Romance of the Commonplace by Gelett Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 3, Dining Out. Why human beings are so fond of eating together and making a ceremonial of the business, it is hard to say. Man is almost the only animal who prefers to consume his food in company with his kind, for even sheep and cattle wander apart as they graze, seeking private delicacies. Early in the morning, it is true, most cultivated persons are savages, preferring to breakfast in seclusion and dishabille. Lunch-time finds them in a slightly barbarous state, and they tolerate company, but by evening we all become gregarious and social, and we resent the absence of an expected companion at the table as of a course omitted. And so, whether we dine at home or abroad, we call it a poor dinner where we have good things only to eat. The dullest, most provincial hostess has come to understand this, and each does what she can in inviting guests to form partnerships or combinations sympathetic and enlivening. There are, of course, always those impossibles, poor relations or what not, whom policy or politeness imperatively demands, and every dinner table is, in attempt at least, a conversational constellation of stars of the first magnitude, separated by lesser lights. From these fixed stars radiate flashes of talk, and supplementing this, the laughter of the connecting circle should follow as punctually as thunder upon lightning. The hostess, like a beneficent sun, kindles and warms and sways her little system, while the servants revolve about the table in their courses, like orderly planets. But we might push the allegory a step farther. Though the round of a score of dinners may exhibit no more unusual a cosmogony than this, yet at every 33rd event, perhaps, we may encounter a comet. There is no prognosticating his eccentric course. He comes and goes according to a mysterious law, but wherever he appears, blazing with a new light, foreign to all our conventions, he is a compelling attraction, drawing the regular and steady orbs of fashion this way and that out of their orbits, shifting their axes, and upsetting social tides and seasons. To such an innovator, a dinner is given not for food, but for pastime, and it is a game of which he may change the rules as soon and as often as they hamper his enjoyment. It matters little to him that he is dressed for a feast of propriety. To him alone it is not a livery. He is not the servant of custom. If it pleases him to settle a dispute out of hand, he will send the butler for the dictionary while the discussion is hot, or more likely go himself forthright. If he wishes to see a red rose in the hair of his host's daughter over against him, he will whip round 2 corners to her place and adjust the decoration. And if it is necessary to his thesis that you, his shocked or amused partner, help him illustrate a Spanish charade, you too must up and help him in the pantomime, if you would not have such fine enthusiasm wasted for a scruple. I knew one such once, who retrieved an almost hopelessly misarranged dinner by his generalship, usurping the power of the hostess herself. The guests were distributed in a way to give the greatest possible discomfort to the greatest number, though from stupidity rather than from malice. Mr. Comet solved the problem at a glance. He rose before the fish was served, with a wineglass in one hand and his serviette in the other. "The gentlemen," he announced, "will all kindly move to the left 4 places." It was before the day of progressive dinner parties, and the scheme was new. The ladies gaped at this audacity, but after this change of partners, the function began to succeed. Your comet, then, must not only be a social anarchist, but he must convert the whole company, or he presents merely the sorry spectacle of a man making a fool of himself, never a sight conducive to appetite or to refined amusement, except perhaps to the cynic. He must be able to swing the situation. He must believe and connive others that the true object of a dinner is to amuse, and if it should take all of the time devoted to the entrée for him to show the pretty sculptress at his right how to model an angel out of bread, his observing hostess should feel no pang that he has neglected his brochette. After all, the elaborate supervision of the menu was undertaken, any modern hostess will acknowledge, only that, in the dire case her guests did not succeed in amusing each other, they might at least have good things to eat. Every dish untasted in the excitement of conversation, then, should be a tribute to her higher skill in experiments with human chemistry. If she can catch no comet, however, she must be contented with lesser meteoric wits, who make up for real brilliancy by saying what they do say quickly and spontaneously, with the punsters in short, and such hair-trigger intellects. Failing these, the last class above the bores positive are those well-meaning diners out who load themselves with stories for a dinner as a soldier goes into an engagement with a belt full of cartridges. They may not get a chance for a shot very often, but given an opening, their fire is accurate and deadly till the last round is gone, when they are at the mercy of a more inventive wit. Yet even these welterweights have their place at the table, for we must have bread as well as wine. It was one of Lewis Carroll's pet fancies to have a dinner table in the shape of a ring, and half the guests seated inside upon a platform which revolved slowly round the circle till each one had circumnavigated the orbit and passed opposite every guest seated on the outside of the table. But this would break up many of the little secret schemes for which the modern dinner is planned, and many a young man would suddenly find himself flirting with the wrong lady across the board. And this last hint carries me from the exoteric to the esoteric charms of the dinner. Here, however, you must guess your own way. I dare not tell you precisely what it means when Celestine shifts her glass from left to right of her plate, nor what I answer when I raise my serviette by one corner, for Celestine and I may dine with you some day, and you may remember our little code. You would better not invite me anyway, for though I am no comet, yet I admit I would be mad enough to upset the claret purposely rather than have nothing exciting happen. Essay 4. The Uncharted Sea. Ay, there's the rub. If we could but forecast our dreams, who would care to keep awake? In that we are no further advanced than in the times of Pythagoras, still clumsy, ignorant amateurs in this most fascinating and mysterious game, played by every race and condition of men under the moon. There are some, maybe, who do not dream, poor half-made men and women, to whom a waking, literal, prosaic life is the whole of existence. They stay idly at home, while you and I take ship upon the unknown sea and navigate uncharted waters every night. Then we are poets, dunces, philosophers, clowns, or madcaps of sorts in a secret carnival, changing not only our costumes, but often our very selves, doffing conscience, habit, and taste to play a new part at each performance. If we could but manage this raree show, and not be mere marionettes, wired to the finger of the magician, what tremendous adventures might we not undertake? We have rare glimpses of the lesser mysteries, but the inner secrets of that inconsequential empire are still undiscovered. The revels confound us. We are whirled, intoxicated or drugged, into a realm of confusion, and out of touch with senses, reason, and will, we cannot quite keep our heads clear. How many of us have tried to "dream true," like Peter Ibbetson, even to obeying the foolish formula he described, lying hands under head, foot upon foot, murmuring his magic words. Try as we may, those of us who are true dreamers can never quite accept the psychologist's explanation of dreams. Some cases may be easily understood, perhaps, such as the pathological influence of a Welsh rarebit, a superabundance of bed-covers, or suggestive noises. We may account, too, for those absurd visions that appear so often on awakening, when one sense after another comes breaking into our consciousness, and when the mind, summoned suddenly to construct some reasonable relation between incongruous floating pictures, seizes upon any explanation, however ridiculous. But of deeper dreams, dreams logical or meaningful, dreams that recur or are shared by others, modern science does not give any satisfactory theory, and we are forced, willingly enough no doubt, to apply the hypotheses of mysticism. There are dreams, too, so progressive and educational that they seem to involve a new science unknown in this workaday world. So many of us have had experiences with levitation in our dream life that we are, so to speak, a cult. I myself began by jumping, timing each spring with the precise moment of alighting from a previous leap, profiting by the rebound, and after many experiments I am now able to float freely, even accomplishing that most difficult of all feats, rising in the air by a deliberate, concentrated effort of will, even while lying on my back. Yet all of us, jumpers, flyers, or floaters, must wait till that wonderful dream comes to us, after months maybe, to indulge in that most exhilarating pastime. Children's dreams are, until they are cruelly undeceived, quite as real as their waking moments, and it may be that we shall, in time, learn the forgotten art from them. It is dependent, no doubt, upon their power of visualizing imagined objects while their eyes are shut, but while still awake. But this ability to call up the images of anything at will is as soon lost as their belief in dreams. Though this habit fades and is forgotten in the growing reality of our outward life, it may not be impossible, with practice, to regain the proficiency, for at times of great physical fatigue and mental exaltation the power comes back, often intensified almost to the point of hallucination. If we could train our imagination then, and learn to see pictures when our eyes are shut, these might become more accurate and real, so that at the moment of sinking into unconsciousness, as we lose hold on tangible things, the vision would become one with the reality, and still imagining and creating, we might pass over the footlights and dream true. To most of us there comes a recognizable moment when we know we are just at the border of sleep. If we could then, with our last effort of will, keep control of the moving pictures, we might go wherever we wished. We might learn, too, to remember more of what happens in the night. We usually give what has passed in dream no more than an indulgent smile, and forget the strangeness of it all as soon as we are well awake. It is as if we had hurriedly turned the pages of an illustrated book. We recall here and there a few striking pictures, beautiful or comic, and the volume is replaced upon the shelves, not to be taken down till the next evening. It is a book from which we learn little. Its contents are not even amusing to anyone else who has as fanciful tales in his own dreamland library. If we could, upon first awakening, impress our minds with the reality of our dreams, we might be able to recall more and more, and find that in spite of their incongruity there was some law which governed their visitation, and some meaning in their grotesque patterns. To one who dreams frequently, bedtime cannot fail to be something to look forward to hope and to prepare for with efforts to capture in the net of sleep some beautiful dream. May we not sometime find the proper bait, and lie down, confident that we shall be duly enchanted in some delightful way according to our desires? Till then we must each buy our nightly ticket in sleep's lottery, and draw a blank or a prize as Morpheus wills. Some say that the most refreshing sleep is absolute unconsciousness of time, that one should shut one's eyes only to open them in the morning, with the night all unaccounted for. But no true dreamer will assent to this. He knows it is not so. I was told in my youth that if I turned the toes of my boots toward the bed, I should have a nightmare. I confess I have never dared try it. But rather than not dream at all, I believe I should be tempted to hazard the experiment. End of Essay 4. Essays 5 and 6 of The Romance of the Commonplace by Gelett Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 5, The Art of Playing. Time was when we made our own toys, when a piece of twine, a spool, a few nails, and a bit of imagination could keep us busy and happy all day long. There were no newfangled iron toys made in Germany, so tiresome in their inevitable little routine of performance, so easily got out of order, and so hard, metallic, and realistic as to be hardly worth the purchase. A penny would, indeed, buy some funny carved wooden thing that aroused a half-hour's excitement, but it was never quite so alluring as when in the front window of the toy shop. Such queer animals never became thoroughly acclimated to the nursery, and they lost their luster in a half-holiday. The things that gave permanent satisfaction were homemade, crude, and capable of transformation. A railway train might, with a small effort of the fancy, become a ship or a dragon. Are there such amateur toy builders now, in this age when everything is perfect and literal, when even a box of building blocks contains a book of plans to supply imaginative design to the modern child? Indeed, many children are nowyears too lazy even to do their own playing. I have heard of one who was used to sit on a chair and order his nurse to align his ninepins and bowl them down for him. Perhaps one notices the lack of creative ability in children more in the city, where ready-made toys are cheap and accessible, than in the country where the whole world is full of wonderful possibilities for entrancing pastime. Nature is the universal playmate, perpetually parodying herself in miniature for the benefit of those who love to amuse themselves with her toys. Every brook is a little river, every pond an unfathomable sea. She plants tiny forests of fern and raises microscopic mountains in every sandbank. Flowers and plants furnish provender for Lilliputian groceries. The oak showers acorn cups. What wonder we believe, as long as we can, in fairies? And yet, strange to say, it is the city more often than the country child who feels the charm of these marvels. The freshness and the strangeness breed a fascinated wonder. It is, after flagged pavements and brick walls, almost too good to be true. The juvenile rustic is more familiar with nature. It is his business to know when the flowers come, where the berries ripen and birds nest. It is scarcely play to him. It is a science to be applied to his personal profit. The woods and rivulets are his familiar domain, to be forayed and hunted specifically for gain. And this, though it is delightful, is not play. For him there is no glamour over the fields until long after, when his native countryside has become inaccessible. Perhaps the art of playing is, after all, a matter more of temperament than environment, for one sees at times good sport even in the city streets, though it is rare nowadays. I had my own full share of it, for my youth was an age of pure romance. My clan had its own code and its own traditions. Every man of us had his suit of wooden armour, his well-wrought weapons, and his fiery steed. We were all for Scott. We had our order, small but well up in the technique of feudal ways, facile in sword-play, both with the thin, sinewy, hard pine rapier and the huge two-handed, double-hiked battle-sword that would stand just as high as one's head. On the brick sidewalks we tilted on velocipedes, full in the view of the anxious passers-by. Capapi and pine sheathed with tin, with a shield blazoned with a tiger couchant, and inscribed with a Latin motto out of the back of the dictionary, many a long red lance I shivered, and many a wheel I broke. On Warren Avenue I did it, opposite the church. What would I not give now to see such sight in town? Instead, I watched little boys smoking cigarettes upon the street corners, waiting for their girls. I knew a youngster, too, who organized in his town a post-office department, established letter-boxes, and a regular service of boy carriers. He drew and colored the stamps himself. You will find them in few collections, though they should have enormous value from their rarity. Some games are consummate play, even though the sport goes awry all too soon. It is too great to last. It is the older brother who should give finesse to such sport. Without him, complications arise which accomplish at last the ruin of the game. Many of us do not truly learn to play until it is too late to do so with dignity, and to these the appreciation of the young gives a fine excuse for prolonging the diversion. We fancy we cannot, when grown up, play imaginative games for the pure joy of it, as does the child. We think we must have an ulterior motive. Yet the father, who whittles out a boat for his son, often gets more delight than the child, who would far rather do it himself, no matter how much more crudely accomplished. The theatre is the typical play for grown-ups. The name itself, play, is significant of the unquenchable tendency of youth. And this reminds me of a most amusing case where two grown-ups dared to be absolutely ingenuous. It was upon a honeymoon, when, if ever, adults have the right to yield to juvenile impulses. As the groom was titled and the bride fair, society took it ill that the two should retire to their country house and deny access to all neighbours. One at last called, too important to be denied admittance by the servants, and the astonished visitor discovered the happy pair stretched over the dining-room table, training flies whose wings had been clipped, to pull, in a harness of threads, little paper wagons. This had been their absorbing occupation for 10 blissful days. An important element of play seems to be the doing of things in miniature. See Stevenson, for instance, prone upon the floor, involved in romantic campaigns, massing his troops of 10 soldiers, occupying strategic positions in hall and passage, skirmishing over the upstairs roads of the third class, impassable for artillery, intercepting commissary trains labouring up from the base of operations in the kitchen, deploying cavalry screens upon the rug, and outmanoeuvring the wily foe that defends the veranda, both being bound by the strict treaties of the play. There is your ideal big brother, and the game of toy soldiers is glorified in 2 weeks of excitement. The Japanese, immortal children, carry the game of diminution to its extreme. The dwarfed trees and the excruciating carved ivories are not the only systems of this delightful disease. For the perfection of the spirit of play, one must see their miniature gardens, often the life employment of the owners. No matter how small the patch of ground employed, every inch is perfect. Pebble by pebble, almost grain by grain, the area is arranged, the tiny rivulet is guided between carefully curved banks, wee bridges span the shores, little lanterns and pagodas are artfully placed, plants and flowers are sown, trees planted, fishes are domiciled, till the garden is a replica of nature at her best. Each view is a toy landscape, and without a scale, as seen in a photograph, for instance, one might think it a garden of the gods. And yet there is a sort of play where one may use infinite distances, macrocosms for microcosm, if one has the courage and the power of visualization. These games are purely mental feats of the imagination, though not nearly so difficult as might be thought. I know a sober workaday lawyer, for instance, who combines the 2 methods with extraordinary cleverness. His income is not derived solely from his practice, I need hardly say. You will not catch him at his fascinating diversion, for his table is strewn with books and papers, and his playthings are not noticeable among the professional litter. I have known him to sit for hours gazing at the table, and once in his confidence, for there is a fraternity of players, and one must give the grip and prove fellowship, he will tell you that he has shrunk to but an inch in height, so that to him his desk seems to be some 300 feet long by 100 feet wide, and its plateau is elevated some 200 feet above the floor, as high, that is, as a church. Assuming that he has, by some miraculous means, shrunk to 1/50th of his stature, the size of everything visible is, of course, increased in a like proportion. His diverting occupation, under this queer state of things, is to explore his little domain, and exist as well as is possible. What adventures has he not had? There was the terrific combat with a cockroach as big as a dragon, which he finally slew with a broken needle. There was the dust storm when the caretaker swept, and the huge snow crystals, like white pie plates, that came in when the window was opened. He had an enormous difficulty in getting water from a glass tumbler, and he broke his teeth upon the crystals of sugar that, as a lawyer, he had been thoughtful enough to strew upon the table for the benefit of himself as an inchling. I believe he is now attempting to escape to the floor by means of a spool of thread, if he cannot make up his mind to risk a descent by means of a paper parachute. It is a world of his own, as real to him as the child's toy paradise, a retreat immune from the cares of his daily life, a never-tiring playground, with perpetual discoveries possible. He, if any one, has discovered not only the art of playing, but has applied the science as well. Essay 6. The Use of Fools. What a dull world it would be if everyone were modest, discreet, and loyal to that conformity which is called good taste. If, in short, there were no fools to keep us amused. What would divert us from the deadly routine of seriousness? What toy scandal would we have to discuss at dinner? What would leaven this workaday world of commonplaces if everyone were gifted with common sense? Is it not, when you stop to think of it, a bit inconsiderate to discountenance buffoonery, and to resent innocently interesting impropriety? Should we not rather encourage eccentricity, with what flattering hypocrisies we may, so that we shall never be at a loss for things to smile at and talk about? A fair sprinkling of fools in the world is as enlivening as a pinch of salt in a loaf of bread. They give a relish to life, and flavour with a brisk spicery of nonsense what would otherwise be oppressively flat. Civilized existence, if it were always cooked up and served to us by Mrs. Grundy herself, would be unpalatable enough. But luckily her infallible recipes are not always carried out, and a few plums and cloves get into her pudding. We may not care to play the part of public jesters ourselves, but the least we can do is to be grateful to those who are willing to become absurd for our benefit. Patronize them daintily, therefore, lest they backslide in propriety. Remember that there is such a thing as enjoyment without ridicule. To make fun of a person to his face is a brutal way of amusing oneself. Be delicate and cunning, and keep your laugh in your sleeve, lest you frighten away your game. But there will doubtless always be enough who are willing to play the guy, whether we encourage or condemn. The fool is a persistent factor in society, and yet the common misconception of his status and economic function is silly and unfair. With the prig and the crank, the fool has been reviled from time immemorial and persecuted out of all reason. He is protected by no legislation. Your fool is always in season, and is the target for universal contempt. Instead of this perpetual fusillade of wits, there should be a close season for fools to allow themselves to propagate and grow fearless, after which we could make game of them in safety of a full supply. Since he is in a way the lubricator of the wheels of life, a coiner of smiles, he should be carefully bred to give the greatest possible amount of diversion. He should be trained, like an actor, that his best points may be brought out. He should be paid a salary, or kept in livery to amuse the public, with no need or excuse for sobriety. But until the fool is properly appreciated and his place assured, we must put up with the amateurs that haunt the street and drawing-room. It is too much to hope for the sight of a zany every time we go outdoors, but when we do encounter one, what a ray of sunshine gleams athwart our strict fashions, poor, sober, dun slaves to style and custom. If we chance upon a woman who dares perpetrate her own radical theories of dress, who combines pink with red, or commits a gay indiscretion in millinery, how superbly she is distinguished, for the moment, from the ruck and swarm of victims to good taste. She is at once an event and a portent. The afternoon is quaintly illuminated with a phenomenon, and we scan with new interest and expectation the dull and sombre throng. How small a deviation from the mode, indeed, is necessary to provoke a revivifying smile. Every such unconscious laughing-stock is a true benefactor, ministering to our sense of superiority. Were we never to seek the freaks, we would not know how glorious is our own uncompromising regularity. Truly, if we have sufficient conceit, everyone in the world, in a way of thinking, may be considered foolish relatively to our own criterion. "All the world is queer except thee and me," said the Quaker, "and even thee is a little queer." Such praise of fools may seem extravagant or illogical, but if it is so, it must be not because the fool is not helpful and stimulating in society, but because, after all, he is not so easily identified as one might suppose. Celestine tells me she never calls a man a fool, but instead asks him why he does so, and in this way she often learns something. That is the most disagreeable trait of fools. Often, upon investigation, what appears to be genuine nonsense is but the consistent carrying out of a clever and original idea, whose novelty alone excites amusement. The fool thus cheats us of our due enjoyment by being in the right. It seems dishonest of a fool to instruct. It is beside the mark, and outside his proper sphere, and yet even Confucius is said to have learned politeness from the impolite. To see one's own faults and weaknesses caricatured spoils the laugh that should testify to the folly. We cannot be sure, either, that the ass who amuses us by his eccentric absurdities may not eventually cheat us of the final victory by proving to be but the vanguard of a new custom to which we or our children must perforce in time succumb, and fall into line with him far behind, only then to count our present attitude foolish and old-fashioned. Let us therefore laugh while we may, for your fool is but a chameleon who refuses to change colour. What to-day is arrant silliness may to-morrow be good horse sense, wherefore it is wise to watch fools carefully when you find them, lest the sport spoil overnight, and you yourself become ridiculous, while the fool takes your place as the amused philosopher. The word fad, they say, was derived from the initial letters of the phrase for a day. So we, the followers of the latest mode and mood, are, it would seem, the true ephemera, and the fools who defy the local custom are immortal. The fool is merely an anachronism. All inventors, most poets, and some statesmen have been honoured with the title, since we laugh chiefly at what we do not understand. There are more synonyms for fool than for any other word in the language. So we must take our chances and smile at all and sundry, at men of one idea, hobby writers, cranks, poseurs, managing mammas and antic youths, blushing brides and fond parents, founders, pedants, bigots, and hens with their heads cut off. Laugh at them, the character parts in the comedy of life, for the show is amusing, but be not resentful if you find the privilege of laughing is a common right, and you in your turn become a victim. For strange as it may seem, many of these actors may be so foolish as to think you the fool yourself. End of Essay 6. Essays 7 and 8 of The Romance of the Commonplace by Gelett Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 7, Absolute Age. When I was a child, I invented a game so simple and so passive that its enjoyment was permitted even on the rigorous Sundays of my youth. Upon a slate I ruled vertical columns, and at the head of these I wrote men, women, boys, girls, babies, horses, dogs. Then, seated at a window commanding the street, I made a note of the passers-by, and as fast as they appeared in sight, I made a mark for each in the appropriate column. The compilation of this petty census was a pleasing pastime, and moreover it seemed to me that my categories were obviously complete. They were, in my world, but men and women, boys, girls, and babies. What else, indeed? But this primary classification of sex and years did not satisfy me long, and I discovered that my system must be amended if I would segregate, mentally now, the various types I encountered. There were, for instance, good persons and bad ones, men educated and ignorant, rich and poor, and I superimposed upon my first list one after another of these modifying conditions. But with a larger view of life, these crude distinctions overlapped and became confused, and I saw that the whole system was but a rude makeshift. Yet until I could pigeonhole a new acquaintance in my own mind and put him with others of his kind, I was never quite satisfied. Up to a certain stage in development, what we are most struck with is the difference between persons, but after the first intellectual climacteric, we began to see resemblances, invisible before, that knit men of different aspect together, and that game of synthesis, once begun, we must play it till we die. Every new acquaintance is an element of our experience, a new fact refuting or corroborating our theory of life, and though we often may put the case into a separate compartment and label the specimen unique, before long we shall probably have to reconsider and devise a new system of arrangement for the complex characteristics of human nature. But what analysis can we adopt which shall prove universally satisfactory? If we rank men according to mental, moral, or spiritual attributes, one quality is sure to contradict or affect the other, and it is hard to decide which trait is paramount. Friendship is dependent upon none of these things, and yet in our affections we recognize almost unconsciously grades and qualities of attraction and kinship. Of a bunch of letters at our breakfast plate, we are sure to open a special one first or last, as the expectation of pleasure may decide. We accept this nearness, this intimate relationship, without reasoning. It is manifested in the first flash of recognition of the handwriting, at sight of a photograph, at the sound of a voice or a name. Some are indubitably of our own clan, and others, however their charm or a temporary passion may blind us for a time, are foreigners and speak another language of the emotions. There are invisible groups of souls, mysteriously related, and the tie is indissoluble. So I have come to adopt as the final classification what, for want of a better term, I must call absolute age. Age or condition, that is, not relative, not dependent upon the year of one's birth. No one, surely, has failed to observe children who seem to be older than their parents in possibility of development. One knows that in a few years this child will have caught up to and passed his father or mother in soundness of judgment, in a sense of the relative importance of things, in the power to distinguish sham, convention, and prejudice from things of vital import. This child is older in point of absolute age. When his soul has served its juvenile apprenticeship in the world of the senses, he shall understand truths his parents never knew. This capacity for comprehending life does not seem to be dependent upon actual, definite experience with the world. The villager may have this hidden wisdom as clearly as the man who has seen and done, who has fought, loved, and traveled far and well. The mystics hold that we have all lived before, and that some have profited by their experiences in former lives, and have attained a fairer conception of the very truth. But though this illustrates what is meant by the term absolute age, it is by no means necessary to accept such an explanation of the effects we perceive. It is enough that we can definitely classify our friends by their emotions and desires, and by their point of view on life. In other words, some are philosophers and some are not. And even the philosophers are of varying sects. Some have a keen, childlike enthusiasm for the more obvious forms of excitement, for all that is new and strange and marvelous, while others are incapable of being shocked, surprised, or embarrassed. They have poise, and prefer the part of observer to that of actor in the game of life. And yet, too, there is a simplicity which comes from a greater absolute age, a relish for real things that persists with enthusiasm. It is by this simplicity one may distinguish the cult from those that are merely blasé or worldly wise. The joy in the taste of the fresh apple under the tongue, or in the abandon of the child at play, in the strength of youth and the grace of women, this is a joy that does not fade. No, not even for those who would not trouble to go to the window if the king rode by. As a man can learn much by travel without losing his capacity for enjoying his native town, so one can enjoy life intellectually to the utmost without ever losing one's grasp on oneself, without being intoxicated by excitement or blinded by egoism, and yet feel still the clean, sane joys of youth to the last. We have come to our absolute age by different paths. If we are of the same status, you and I, you may have learned one lesson and I another, yet the sum of our experience is the same. We are akin spiritually, although we have not had the same process of development. You perhaps have fought down hate, and I have conquered dishonesty, but we are calmer and wiser, we think, than those whom we smile at quietly when we view their eagerness for things that no longer concern us. We recognize, too, that there are others to whose attainments our own powers are infantile, but in either case the superiority is neither mental nor moral nor spiritual. It is that mysterious inherent quality we call caste. Essay 8. The Manual Blessing. Surely if there is one sharp, active sensation that in this changeful life of ours we never tire of, never outgrow, it is in the satisfaction of creative manual work. There is a conservation of pleasure as there is a conservation of energy, and our taste is being continually transmuted and evolved. One by one we outlive the joys of youth, the delights of physical exercise, the zest of travel, the beatitude of emotion, the singing raptures of love, passing from each to a more mature appeal, a more refined appetite, a subtler demand of the intellect or of the spirit. The familiar games lose their savor, the dance gives way to the drama, travel to the calmer investigation of homely miracles. We tire of seeing and begin to read, feasting peacefully at the banquet of the arts that other men have spread. This is, for many of us, what age means, a giving up of active for passive pleasures when the old games lose their charm. But the joy of creation does not fade, for in that lies our divinity and our claim to eternity. Each new product arouses the same thrill, the same spiritual excitement, the same pride of victory, and yet, strangely enough, though we think we work only for the final notch of accomplishment, it is not the completion, but the construction that holds us entranced. Not the last stroke, but every stroke brings victory. It is like the climbing of a mountain. Do we endure the toil merely for the sake of the view at the summit? No, but for the primitive passion of conflict, the inch-by-inch fight against odds, the heaping of endeavor on endeavor, the continual measuring of what has been done with what remains to do. The finishing climax is but the exclamation point at the end of the sentence. Most of the sensation has been used up before we come to the full stop, and that point serves but to sum up our emotion in a visible emblem of success. Many of us believe we are debarred from the exercise of this divine birthright, the joy of creation. We have neither talent nor genius, not even that variety which consists in the ability to take infinite pains. Are we not mistaken in this? I think we may each have our share of the immortal stimulus. To understand this, we must go back and back in the history of the race, and there we shall find that this satisfaction, this sane and virile delight in construction, was possible to the meanest member of the tribe. Its enjoyment came chiefly in the exercise of a laborious persistency in little things. The combination or addition of the simplest elements achieved a positive pleasurable result. The Neolithic man chipped and chipped at his flint until the arrowhead was perfected, and his joy, had he been able to analyze it, was not so much in the last stroke as in every stroke. Not so much that he had himself with his own hands made something, as that he had been making something of use and beauty, and the possibility of that joy abiding with him as long as he lived. The makers of ancient pottery repeated the same shapes and designs, or, if their fancy soared, dared new inventions, but the satisfaction was in the doing. The carvers and joiners of the Middle Ages worked as amateurs in cottage and hovel, and in their work lay their content. No tyranny could wrest from them this wellspring of pleasure. Old age could but weaken the hand. I doubt if it could tame the immemorial joy of creation. We cannot all be professional mechanics, for the division of labor has cast our lot more and more with the workers in intellectual pursuits. But we might make handicraft an avocation, if not a vocation, and that regimen would help our digestion, perhaps, more than pepsin or a course of the German baths. Were I a physician, I should often recommend the Craft Cure, a panacea for dyspepsia, ennui, and nostalgia. Here is my modern health resort, my sanatorium for these most desperate of diseases, a little hamlet of shops and tents on the foothills of the Coast Range in California, where, as you work, you can look across a green valley to the blue Pacific. Here in this new land nature calls fondly to your soul, and you may turn to the primitive delights of living and taste the tang of the dawn of civilization, fresh and wholesome as a wild berry. Here, squatting on the bare, sun-parched ground, with an Indian blanket over his shoulders, is a corpulent banker with a flint hammer battering a water-worn boulder. Thus, less than 100 years ago, the Temecula Indians hollowed out their stone mortars on this very mesa. Thus they spent happy days, slept like bears, and were up with the birds each morn a day younger than yesterday. In this lodge of deerskins, where the ground is spread with yellow poppies, sits an ex-secretary of legation, who has known everything, seen everything, done everything but this, to cut with a knife of shell strange patterns upon a circular horn gorget. Finished, his wife might wear it with pride at the court of St. James, yet it is but the reproduction of a prehistoric ornament, its figures smeared with ochre, cobalt, and vermilion, and inlaid with lumps of virgin copper by the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley. In this open shelter of bamboo, a trysting place for meadow larks and song sparrows, lies stretched upon the ground an East India warehouseman, all his gout and lumbago forgotten in the rapturous delight of printing a pattern of checkered stripes with a carved wooden block upon a sheet of tapa, which he himself, unaided mind you, has pounded from the fibrous bark of the paper mulberry. His strenuous daughter, once world-worn and frozen, has left Nietzsche, Brahms, and the cult of the symbolist to sit cross-legged and weave the woolly zigzags of a Navajo blanket. It is the first thing she has made with her 10 fingers since she baked mud pies in the sun. Had she now a scrap of mirror in her bungalow, she could now face it without mortification. An open-air hand-loom is good for the complexion. But you need not journey to California. Rather, make a pilgrimage to your own south attic. If you do but construct cardboard model houses with isinglass windows in your breakfast room, you will perhaps find that more diverting than collecting cameos or first editions. If you can only compile a concordance to Alice in Wonderland, you may achieve a hygienic and rejuvenative distraction. Can you cut, stamp, gild, paint, lacquer, and emboss a leather belt? Can you hammer jewelry out of soft virgin silver? No? But you could, though, if you tried. Can you forget the impositions of convention in the rapt glow of pride in sawing and nailing together a wooden box? No matter how small it might be, how leaky of joint or loose of cover, it would hold all your worries. End of Essay 8. Essays 9 and 10 of The Romance of the Commonplace by Gelett Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 9, The Deserted Island. A friend of mine is curiously hampered by a limitation precluding him from association with anyone conversant with the details of the manufacture of cold-drawn wire. To show that this self-imposed abstinence may indicate a most charming devotion to an ideal, rarely shown by the commonplace, is the object of this thesis, and that, too, despite the fact that an indiscriminating extension of the same principle would lead the radical to eschew the society of most of his acquaintances, as well as bar out the whole domain of didactic literature. When the day is done, and that entrancing hour is come, for which some spend many of their waking hours in anticipation, to those blessed with fancy, the curtain of the dark arises, and within the theatre of the night are played strange comedies. To a select performance I invite all uninitiated who have never enjoyed the drama of the deserted island, the perfect and satisfactory employment for the minutes that elapse after retiring and before the anchor is weighed and the voyage begun upon the Sea of Dreams. There are undoubtedly more than I am aware of who are happy enough to maintain deserted islands of their own, many more, perhaps, than would confess to the possession. To some the history may be well under way, they have long since discovered their island, and many improvements have already been successfully completed. Others, more adventurous, handicapped by stricter limitations and more meagre outfit, are still struggling with the primal demands of food and shelter. But to those whose imaginations have never put so far out to sea and would welcome this modest diversion, I advise an expedition of discovery and exploration this very night. You have but to go to bed, close your eyes, and after a few preliminaries you are there. Authorities differ as to the allowable equipment for the occupancy of the sequestered territory. I myself hold that it is manifestly unfair to be provided with tools of any kind. To have a knife now I would call cheating. Surely the only legitimate beginning is to be vomited upon the beach stark naked from the sea, after some fearsome shipwreck in mid-ocean. Then, after years of occupancy, a man might taste the pride of his own resources, unfettered by any legacy inherited from civilization. Settle this point as you may, when the conditions of the game are once understood, the whole history of science is to be reenacted. I have a friend who arrived upon the scene in an open boat containing a keg of water, a crowbar, a pruning knife, a red silk handkerchief, and a woman's petticoat, and with these promiscuous accessories has, in the course of years, transformed the place, which now boasts a stone castle, entirely inhabitable. His island is about 2 miles long and a half-mile wide, much too narrow for comfort, I assert. The proportions should be about 5 miles by 3, with one dominant hill from which the whole territory may be surveyed. But the owner of the other island, he of the cold-drawn wire, boldly asserts his right to a half-dozen laborers, presumably natives, and with this force at his disposal he has done wonders with his fief. Glass has been manufactured, fabrics woven, ore smelted, and fine roads constructed, so that there now remains nothing to be desired but bicycles upon which he and his slaves may traverse the highways. But in vain his unskilled assistants look to him for advice. Rack his wits as he may, he can devise no adequate system of making cold-drawn wire, and he is beginning to lose caste with his followers. Now, at first sight, one might think it necessary for him only to consult an encyclopedia, or to visit an iron mill, yet this course is strictly barred out by the rules of the game, which compels one to use only such information as comes naturally to hand, for one is likely to be cast ashore upon a desert island at any moment, and it is then too late for the research and education that has been before neglected. With any ingenious fellow who has his own amateur ideas on the subject, one may, of course, talk freely, for he may represent one of the more intelligent of the natives. But all they who really know whereof they speak are to be avoided. So the problem of the cold-drawn wire is still unsolved. I know of an artist who, free on this enchanted spot, has turned his energies to those diverting pursuits for which his studio leaves no time, and he builds gigantic rock mosaics on the cliffs, selecting from the many-colored boulders on the beach. Luxuries are his only necessities even in his daily life, and the enormity of his trifling on this holiday playground is a thing to wonder at. His art, so used to a censorship of nature in his professional mimicries, here goes boldly forth, and so mends, prunes, and patches the aspect of his island, that the place is now, he says, absolutely perfect, a consummation not altogether discreditable to a nude, near-sighted man, whose eyeglasses were washed off before he arrived on the spot. But taking the situation seriously, what will he be in the years to come? By what gradations shall the lonely artist sink to low and lower levels, abandoned by the stimulus of the outer world, the need for advance, and the struggle for recognition? How soon would he lose the desire to render, in the medium at hand, the lovely forms of nature about him, the subtle tones of the earth and air, lapsing by stages into ever cruder forms of expression, till the whole history of his development had been reversed, and he became content with rude squares, triangles, and circles for his patterns, the barbarous effigies of the human form, and the primary colors that satisfy the savage? And the sense of humor, too, that universal solvent of all our miseries, the oil that lubricates the cumbrous machinery of life, how soon would that go? Is it not, in the last analysis, dependent upon the by-play of the social relationship of men? The inconsistencies of our fellows must be first noticed before we can get the reflected light of ridicule upon our own grotesque actions. It would soon be lost in such a sojourn, our impatience would have no foil, we would take ourselves more and more seriously, until the end came upon that day when we had at last forgotten how to laugh. But, after all, as this text of the hypothetical deserted island is better fitted for a romance than for a sermon, we may leave such forebodings and trace out only the rising curve of improvement. And so, too, interesting as it might be to experience, we may leave aside the moral speculations incident to the discussion of the case where the place becomes occupied by a man and a woman. The possibilities of a shipwreck in company are not for such a brief memoir as this. They offer consideration too intimate for these discreet pages, and are best left to the exclusion of a private audience. But choose your company carefully, I entreat you, if you are not soberly minded to be shipwrecked alone. I know of persons with whom, were I cast ashore, there could be no end not tragic, albeit these are highly respectable and praiseworthy individuals, who never did any harm except in that trick of manner by which we recognize the bore. I am often inclined to test the merits of others by mentally permitting them a short visit to my island, but the hazard is too great, and the thought of the possibility of their footprints upon the sand unnerves me. Yet to a distant islet of this fantastic archipelago I seriously consider consigning certain impossible acquaintances, absolutely intolerable personalities, whose probable fate, forced to endure each other's society, interests me beyond words. Upon one side of this far-away retreat rises a steep cliff overhanging the sea, and here I behold in imagination one after another of these marooned unfortunates pushed headlong over the slope, as, unable to support the society of his companions, each has in turn, by some stratagem, lured his hated accomplice in misery to the summit of the cliff. But of one island I have not yet spoken. I can get no description of it, save that it lies sleeping in the summer sun, washed by the sapphire tides, and fanned by the cool south winds, its olive slopes rising softly from the beach, marked by a grove of fruit trees at the crest. More, the owner will not tell, for Celestine says there is no use for a deserted island after it is charted. But by these signs I shall know the place, and my trees are felled, and my sails are plaited, that shall yet bear me over towards the southwest. Essay 10. The Sense of Humor. Much as one may look through the small end of a telescope and find an unique and intrinsic charm in the spectacle there offered, so to certain eyes the whole visible universe is humorous. From the apparition of this dignified little ball, rolling soberly through the starry field of the firmament, to the unwarrantable gravity of a neighbor's straw hat, macrocosm and microcosm may minister to the merriment of man. There is more in heaven and earth than is dreamed of in the philosophy of the realist. It is one attribute of a man of parts that he shall have, in his mental vision, what corresponds to the accommodation of his eye, a flexibility of observation that enables him to adapt his mind to the focus of humor. Myopia and strabismus we know. The dullard can point their analogies in the mental optics, but for this other misunderstood function we have no name. And yet, failing that, we have dignified it as a sense apart, the sense of humor. But no form of lens has been discovered to correct its aberration and transfer the message in pleasurable terms to the lagging brain. And, unless we attempt hypnotism as a last resort, the prosiest must go purblind for life, missing all but the baldest jokes of existence. Is it not significant that from the ancient terminology of leechcraft, this word humor has survived in modern medicine, to be applied only to the vitreous fluid of the eye? For humor is the medium through which all the phenomena of human intercourse may be witnessed, and for those normal minds that possess it, tints this world with a rare color, like that of the mysterious ultraviolet rays of the spectrum. And indeed, to push further into modern science and speculation, perhaps this ray does not undulate, but shoots forth undeviating as truth itself, like that from the cathode pole. Or does it not strike our mental retina from some secret fourth dimension? But this is mere verbiage, similes, flattering to the elect, but unconvincing to the uninitiate. Yet, as I am resolved that humor is essentially a point of view, I would have a try at proselytizing for the doctrine. For here is a religion ready-made to my hand. I have but to raise my voice and become its prophet. The seeds are all sown, the fraternity broods, hidden in hidden chapters, guarding the grand hailing sign. Who knows but that a spark might not touch off this seasoned fuel, and the flames carry everything before it? O my readers, I give you the philosophy of mirth, the cult of laughter. Yet it is an esoteric faith, mind you, unattainable by the multitude. Not of the tee-hee, papa's dead school, nor of the giggling punsters are its devotees. No comic weekly shall be its organ. It must be hymned not by the hoarse guffaw, but in the quiet inward smile. And for its ritual I submit the invisible humor of the commonplace. O paradox! Brethren, from this flimsy pulpit I assert with sincerity that everything on 2 legs, and most on 4, sleeping or awake, bow-legged or knock-kneed, has its humorous aspect. The curtain never falls on the diversion. You will tell me, no doubt, that here I ride too hard. Adam, you will say with reason, set aside in the beginning certain animals for our perpetual amusement, to wit, the goose, the monkey, the ostrich, the kangaroo, and, as a sublime afterthought, symbol of the eternal feminine, the hen. Civilization, you may admit, has added to these the goat, but save in rare moods of insanity, as when the puppy pursues the mad orbit of his tail, the sight of only the aforesaid beasts makes for risibility. The cat, you will say, is never ridiculous, but here again we must hark back to the major premise, unrecognized though it be by the science of aesthetic, that humor lies in the point of view. If I could prove it by mere iteration, it would go without further saying that it is essentially subjective rather than objective. Surely there is no humor in insensate nature, as there is little enough in art and music. The bees, the trees, the fountains and the mountains take themselves seriously enough, and though, according to the minor poets, the fields and the brooks are at times moved to laughter, it is from a vegetable, pointless joy of life. Through the human wit alone, and that too rarely, the rays of thought are refracted in the angle of mirth, and split into whimsical rays of complementary sensations and contrasts. When we lay off the mantle of seriousness, and relax the flexors and extensors, if we are well fed, healthy, and of a peaceful mood and capable of indolence, men and women, and even we ourselves, should become to our view players on the stage of life. And what, then, is comedy but tragedy seen backward or downside up? It is the negative or corollary of what is vital in this great game of life. The custom has been, however, to give it a place apart and unrelated to the higher unities, as the newspapers assign their witticisms to isolated columns. Rather is it the subtle polarity induced by graver thought, the reading between the lines of the page. And as, to the vigorous intellect, rest does not come through inactivity so much as by a change of occupation, the happy humorist is refreshed by the solace of impersonality. For to the initiate his own inconsistencies and indiscretions are no less diverting than those of his associates, and should frequently give rise to emotions that impel him to hurry into a corner and scream aloud with mirth. It is ever the situation that is absurd, and never the victim, and in this lies the secret of his ability to appreciate a farce of which he himself is the hero. He must disincarnate himself as the whim blows, and hang in the air, a god for the time, gazing with amusement at the play of his own ridiculous failures. In some such way, perhaps, do the curious turn over the patterned fabric, to discover, on the reverse, the threads and stitches that explain the construction of the design. This faculty, then, gives one the stamp of caste by which one may know his brethren the world over, an order of whose very existence many shall never be aware, till, in some afterlife, some grinning god conducts them to the verge of the heavens, and, leaning over a cloud, bids them behold the spectacle of this little planet swarming with its absurdly near-sighted denizens. Ohé, la Renaissance! For this is to be the age of humour. We travail for the blithe rebirth of joy into the world. The decadence, with its morbid personalities and accursed analysis of exotic emotion, is over, please God. Yet we may adopt its methods and refine the simplicity of primary impulse, thus increasing the whole sum of pleasure with the delicate nuances that amplify the waves of feeling. Hark, O my reader! Do you not hear them, rising like overtones, and turning the melody into a divine harmony? End of Essay 10. Essays 11 and 12 of The Romance of the Commonplace by Gelett Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 11, The Game of Correspondence. The receipt of a letter is no longer the event it was in the old stagecoach days. Railways and the penny postage have robbed it of all excitement. One expects now one's little pile of white, blue, and green envelopes beside one's plate at breakfast, along with one's toast and coffee, and one tastes its contents as one opens the matutinal egg. We have forgotten how to write interesting letters, as we have forgotten how to fold and wafer a sheet of foolscap or sharpen a quill. Some of our missives are not even worth a cursory glance, many by no means deserve an answer, and most are speedily forgotten in the columns of the morning journal. Yet at times, on red-letter days, we find one amongst the number which demands Epicurean perusal. It is not to be ripped open and devoured in haste. It insists on privacy and attention. This has a flavor which the salt of silence alone can bring out. A dash of interruption destroys its exquisite delicacy. More than this, it must be answered while it is still fresh and sparkling, after which, if it be of the true vintage, it can afford still another sip to inspire your postscript. To your room, then, with this, and lock the door, or else save it for a more impregnable leisure. Open it daintily, and entertain it with distinction and respect. Efface any previous mood, and hold yourself passive to its enchantment. It is no love message, and need depend upon no excited interest in the writer for its reception, for it has an intrinsic merit. It is the work of an artist. It is a fascinating move on the chessboard of the most alluring, most accessible game in the world. Though the fire of such a letter need have neither the artificiality of flirtation nor the intensity of love, yet it must both light and warm the reader. It is not valuable for the news it brings, for if it be a work of art, the tidings it bears are not so important as the telling of them. It must be sincere and alive, revealing and confessing, a letter more from the writer than to the reader, as if it were written in face of a mirror rather than before the photograph of the receiver. And yet the communication must be spelled in the cipher of your friendship, to which only you have the key. We have our separate languages, each with the other, and there are emotions we cannot duplicate. This missive is for you, and for you only, or it ranks with a business communication. It is minted thought, invested, put out at loan for a time, bringing back interest to stimulate new speculations. There are no superfluous words, for the master strikes a clean, sharp blow, forging his mood all of a single piece, welding your whim to his, and fusing his sentences, there glows a spirit, a quality of style that bears no affectation. It must not, of all things, become literary. It must be direct, not showing signs of operose polish. It must be writ in the native dialect of the heart. If it be a risk to write frankly, it is one that gains interest in the same proportion. It makes the game the better sport. But, after all, how many letters, so fearfully burned, so carefully hid away, but what in after years would seem innocuous? You are seduced by the moment, and your mood seems, and impulses seem, dangerous, incendiary. You grow perfervid in your indiscretion, not knowing that the whole world is stirred by the same recklessness, and that each one is profoundly bored by all save his own yearnings. Not many of our epistles will bear the test of print on their own merit, expurgate them as you will. You need only fear, rather, that the letter will grow dull even before it reaches its destination. The best of them, moreover, are written in sympathetic ink, and unless your correspondent has the proper reagent at hand, the sheets will be empty or incomprehensible even to him. Answer speedily as you may, too, it will be hard to overtake your correspondent's mood. He has overburdened his mind, precipitated the solution, and is off to another experiment by the time his stamp is affixed. But you must do your best in return. Reflect enough of his ray to show him he has shot straight, and then flash your own color back. There are virtues of omission and commission. It is not enough to answer questions. One must not add the active annoyance of apology to the passive offense of neglect. One must not hint at things untellable. One must give the crisp satisfaction of confidences wholly shared. Who has not received that dash of feminine inconsequence in the sentence, "I have just written you 2 long letters, and have torn them both up"? What letter could make up such an exasperation? Your master letter-writer does not fear to stop when he is done, either, and a blank page at the end of the folio does not threaten his conscience. If one has not the commonplace view of things, and escapes the obvious, it matters little whether one uses the telescope or the microscope. One may deal with the abstract or concrete, discuss philosophy and systems, or gild homely little common things till they shine and twinkle with joy. Indeed, the perfect letter-writer must do both, and change from the intensely subjective to the intensely objective point of view. He must, as it were, look you in the eye and hold you by the hand. 2 masters whose letters have recently been printed may illustrate these 2 different phases of expression, though each could do both as well. And this first, from Browning's love letters, describes what the perfect letter should be. I persisted in not reading my letter in the presence of my friend. I kept the letter in my hand, and only read it with those sapient ends of the fingers which the mesmerist makes so much ado about, and which really did seem to touch a little of what was inside. Not all, however, happily for me, or my friend would have seen in my eyes what they did not see. To this the twittering, delightful familiarities of Stevenson. 2 Sundays ago the sad word was brought that the sow was out again. This time she had brought another in her flight. Moores and I and Fanny were strolling up to the garden, and there by the waterside we saw the black sow, looking guilty. It seemed to me beyond words. But Fanny's cri du coeur was delicious. "Grrr!" she cried. "Nobody loves you." It was the same art in big and little, for each stripped off pretense and boldly revealed his moment's personality. And yet, a letter does not depend upon any artistic quality or glib facility with words for its interest. The one test of a letter is that it must bring the writer close to your side. You must fasten your mood on me, so that I shall be you for hours afterward. It sounds easy enough, but it is the most difficult thing in the world, to be oneself. I long for you so much that I thank God upon my knees that you are not here. There now is a letter that promises well, but I dare not quote more of it, for the subject must be seen from another side. Essay 12. The Cast of the Articulate. Fair or unfair though it be, I have come to accept a letter as the final test of the personality of a new acquaintance. Not of his or her intellect or moral worth, perhaps, but the register of that rare power which dominates all attributes, that peculiar aroma, flavour, timbre, or colour, which makes some of our friends eternally exceptional. Who dares classify him and label him, sins against the Holy Ghost. I, for one, think I know him only inasmuch as I refuse to sum him up. I cannot find his name in the dictionary, I cannot make a map of him, I cannot write his epitaph. So writes Sonia of a friend with such a personality, and you will see by this that Sonia herself is of the cast of the articulate. We are influenced first by sight, and then by sound, and lastly by the written word. She spoke, and lo, her loveliness methought she damaged with her tongue, is the description of many a woman who appeals to the eye alone. And in something the same way, many who fascinate us with their glamour while face to face, shock us by the dreary commonplaceness of their letters. It would seem that an interesting person must inevitably write an interesting letter. Indeed, that should be a part of the definition of the term interesting. But many decent folk are gagged with constraint and self-consciousness, and never seem to get free. I wonder, says Little Sister, whether these wordless folks may not, after all, really feel much more deeply than we who write. That is a troublesome question, and in its very nature unanswerable, since the witnesses are dumb. No doubt they feel more simply and unquestioningly, for as soon as a thing is once said, its opposite and contradictory side, as true and as necessary, reacts upon us. But it seems to me that expression does not so much depend upon any spiritual insight, or even upon a special training, as it does upon the capacity for being oneself frankly and simply. That is the only thing necessary to make the humblest person interesting, and yet nothing is so difficult as to be oneself in this wild, whirling world. Expression is but another name for revelation. Unless one is willing to expose oneself like Lady Godiva, or protected only by such beauty and sincerity as hers, one can go but a little way in the direction of individuality. We must sacrifice ourselves at every turn, show good and bad alike, and laugh at ourselves too. Would that mine enemy might write a book is no insignificant curse, and yet there are tepid, colourless authors who might hazard it with safety. No one would ever discover the element of personality. After our quarrel I felt as if I had a pebble in my shoe all day, Little Sister once wrote me. Let that be an example of the articulate manner, for by such vivid and homely metaphors she strews her pages. Did she reserve such phrases for her written words, I would feel bound to claim for letter writing the distinction of being an art of itself, unrelated to any other faculty. But no, she talks in the same way. She is herself every moment. My temper is violent and sudden, but it soon evaporates, she tells me. It is like milk spilt on a hot stove. The inspiration which impels one to illustrate an abstract statement with a concrete example, illuminating and convincing, is a spark of the divine fire of personality. This is the crux of the articulate cast. An ounce of illustration is worth a pound of proof. Rob poetry of metaphor, and it would be but prose. A simile in verse is usually merely ornament. The true purpose of tropes, however, is more virile and sustaining. They should reinforce logic, not decorate it. See how agilely Pereira can compress the whole history of a flirtation into 6 lines, defying the old saying that there is nothing so difficult to relight as a dead love. I thought I saw a stiffened form lying in its shroud. I looked again, and saw it was the love we once avowed. "They told me you were dead," I cried. The corpse sat up and bowed. When one has a few such acquaintances as these, books are superfluous. Who would read a dead romance when one can have it warm and living, vibrant, human, coming, like installments of a serial story, a perpetual revelation of character? Many pride themselves upon their proficiency in matter and many in manner. There are those, even, who boast of mere quantity, but your professional writer is usually cool and calm, if not affected and pretentious. A letter, though, should be impregnate with living fire. It should boil. It is a treat of exceptional human nature. If the sentences be not spontaneous and unstudied, the pleasure is lost. One may write fiery nonsense, but one must mean it at the time. One's mind must, as Sonia says, be hospitable, keep open house, and have the knack of making one's friends at home. To throb with one's own delights and despairs. One must give every mood open-handed, and mention nothing one may not say outright with gusto. But it is not every one who can bathe in rich young feeling and steep in day-dawning and green-bedewed grasses, like my little Sonia. If I were dead, she could still strike sparks out of me with her letters. "Oh, if you could only see my new hat! I've been sitting in fetish worship half the evening, and I'll never dare tell how much I paid for it. You never need to be good-looking under such a hat as that, for no one will ever see you." Does not this quotation bring little sister very near to you, and make her very human and real? Ah, little sister is not afraid to be herself. She knows that she can do nothing better. "It's a terrible handy thing to have a smashing adjective in your pocket," she confesses. Little sister has a good aim, too. She always hits my heart. And yet she acknowledges that there are days when letters are blankly impossible. Such friends write the kind of letters that one keeps always, the kind that can be reread without skipping. It is their own talk, their own lives, their own selves, put up like fruit preserves of various flavors, moods, and colors, warranted not to turn or spoil. And as for the gagged, wordless folk, it is my opinion that too much sensibility has been accredited to them. To any rich, exotic nature, expression must come as a demand not to be refused. It is feeling bubbling over into words. Other souls are compressed and silent. They have the possibilities of the bud. Something warm and inspiring may at any time make them expand and free them from the constraint. But there is not much perfume until the flower blooms. End of Essay 12.